Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? So today I am thrilled to welcome Chip Conley, a visionary entrepreneur, award-winning author, and near-death experience survivor who's on a powerful midlife mission. Chip is renowned for disrupting multiple industries and is the CEO and founder of the Modern Elder Academy, or MEA, which is the world's first midlife wisdom school that's dedicated to reframing the concept of aging. Inspired by his experience of intergenerational mentoring as a modern elder at AirBnB, where Chip's guidance was instrumental to the company's extraordinary transformation from fast-growing startup to the world's most valuable hospitality brand, MEA supports students to navigate midlife with a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. A New York Times bestselling author, Chip's seventh book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age, which I totally agree with, is about rebranding midlife to help people understand the upside of this often misunderstood life stage. And the week launching Learning to Love Midlife in January of 2024, Chip was featured as a guest on Good Morning America and the Today Show. And the book rose to the number one happiness self-help book on Amazon. Chip is constantly challenging the status quo and redefining what's possible. And so I am incredibly excited to hear what he has to share with us today. And with that, welcome to the show, Chip.
Honored to be here and look forward to this conversation.
Likewise. So let's get this party started with a conversation that I pose to all of my guests. And that is, what does future ready mean to you?
It's funny, I'm going to answer that by giving you a question back. And that is, 10 years from now, what will you regret if you don't learn it or do it now? It's one of my favorite questions. So let's unpack this for a moment.
Yeah.
So there are things that you now know in your life or have done in your life that you wish you'd done or learned 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We can think of those. I can think, okay, I wish 10 years ago I had learned how to surf, or I wish I had learned Spanish. Now, I did learn those a few years ago, but not 10 years ago. But then the more important question is to be future ready. 10 years from now, what will you regret if you don't learn it or do it now?
Right.
Because anticipated regret is a form of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And so when you actually are thinking into the future, and a lot of people aren't very good at this in terms of, I don't want to think about the future. Well, if you imagine the future and ask yourself, for me, I'm 63 now, at 73, what would I regret? I know my number one answer to that is so appropriate for today, because I'm flying to Houston today from Santa Fe, where I'm located, where our second MEA campus is. And I'm spending the next 3 days, 3.5 days with my two sons, who are 12 and 9 in Houston. And so I love this. I love the fact that I know that my role as the biological dad to a couple of two women who were raising the kids, who were my friends, they wanted me to be the sperm donor. But I know that 10 years from now, I'll regret if I don't really spend a ton of time every month with my boys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's an important, to me, being future ready is not just corporate thinking about like, how do we prepare for the future and the trends?
Right.
I mean, I love that. I'm a trend watcher, but I actually think where it gets really interesting is when it's personalized to your life.
Right.
And so I think this question is a beautiful question that helps helps you to curate your life and have the catalyst of what do you want to spend time on now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love that. And what I think is really brilliant about it is that it forces you to work from the future back. Right. And that is actually how I approach the work that I do, is working from the future back, and to remember that you can actually apply that lens in your personal life as well, because we no longer live where work and life are separate, right? That's the beauty of the evolution, is that we're now recognizing that we are whole people, and you really need to look at these work and life as interconnected. And then to your point, then you can really start to see, because of this interconnection, well, okay, where am I trying to get to? And then how can I work from the future back? Because then you can start to break what may feel insurmountable or overwhelming into smaller, concrete steps. So I love that. And to answer your question, what would I regret? I would keep it very ethereal, if you will, and say, I would regret not having faith in that I'm on the right path, even though it might be hard.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's a helpful question. And this is one of the reasons that I created MEA, was because I think asking provocative, life-altering questions in midlife is really important, because it allows you to get clearer on what's meaningful to you, what matters, and then possibly consciously curate your life differently based upon that. Because otherwise we end up in midlife just doing the same old thing we've been doing for the prior 10, 20, 30 years. And we wonder why we're bored or uninspired or feeling more irrelevant.
Or unfulfilled, or I think that asking questions is incredibly important. And I think that's a good segue into my next question around curiosity, because curiosity is rooted in asking questions, and curiosity is one of the essential ingredients of the future readiness recipe, because it encourages you to explore new possibilities, question assumptions, and remain open to new ideas. And this really enhances your ability to anticipate and proactively respond to emerging trends and challenges. And as well know, intellectually curious people, they think outside the box. They have a passion for understanding the world around them. And you've said, and I wholeheartedly agree, that curiosity is not a luxury of philosophers, but a business and leadership essential that also just might catapult your company. And so I'm curious, what are some ways that you cultivate your curiosity and prepare your mind for future-oriented and exploratory thinking?
So let's start by saying, when I joined Airbnb as a 52-year-old, when the average age in the company was 26, the founders called me their modern elder. And I didn't like that at first, because I thought they were making fun of my age. But then they said, Chip, a modern elder is someone who's as curious as they are wise. And when I heard that, I love the idea of the alchemy of curiosity and wisdom. And they're both important. Curiosity creates wisdom, though. Curiosity is also the taproot for creativity and innovation. And in the business world, creativity and innovation get all of the attention. Curiosity doesn't. But it's really at the core of what the source material of what makes creativity and innovation happen.
Absolutely.
So curiosity requires space, though. And part of the challenge in organizations is, if everybody's on the treadmill going as fast as possible, curiosity is hard to curate, because if you have a 30-minute meeting and let's say, okay, let's get curious in this meeting, it's like, curiosity takes more than 30 minutes. And so let's start by saying it's a really great practice. Back in my day at Joie de Vivre and at Airbnb, we would have a quarterly curious day, and we would do an offsite where the whole purpose of the offsite was to have very little on the agenda, but ask using appreciative inquiry questions, which is a form of how do you ask provocative, potential-filled questions. It's something we teach at MEA. How do we help ourselves to see we have more options and more possibilities than we thought we had? Sometimes when we do those quarterly days, we might go to a zoo, or we might go to a museum, because the intention was to not be in the habitual. If your habitat and habitual have the same root. So the problem with being in the same habitat you're used to and then having a brainstorm is you're habitual.
You can't break out of the box.
That's right.
You're seeing the box.
that's why we get a lot of leadership teams and peer-to-peer networks who come to MEA, one of our two campuses, either in Baja in Mexico or here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because they want a space to think bigger and broader thoughts that make them curious, but also help them to understand, what does the future look like? And I love when someone says to me, okay, tell me where are you going with MEA? And their natural instinct is to say, like, where do you want to be in the next year or two? And I like to say, okay, 5 or 10 years from now, here's
Right.
where I want us to be, and let's work backwards from there and
Right.
get curious about what are the steps we need to take to get to that place.
Exactly. And what's coming up for me is, first of all, nature as teacher, right? Spending time in nature is a really powerful way to stimulate curiosity and future-oriented thinking, whether it's nature's patterns and cycles, the resilience, all of that offers profound lessons. That's why, for me, horseback riding it is actually so germane to what I do as a futurist. It continues to boggle my mind what I learn, or whether it's regular retreats or nature walks. All of that really help you connect with the bigger picture and inspire innovative thinking. And the other thing that's coming up for me is, I love how you actually create that intentional time. And I think that's really important. And I also think it's important for people to remember there are ways that you can create curiosity triggers, whether that's going to a museum or nature, but it also doesn't have to begin with big monumental questions or revolutionary ideas, right? It can start with something small. You've got to start somewhere, because for you and I, this might sound shocking. Intellectual curiosity doesn't come natural to everybody, right?
Yeah. What are the risks? I don't have a blog post, but if you in front of me on this, but I wrote a blog post. I have a daily blog. It's on the MEA website called Wisdom
Mm-hmm.
Well. And I wrote a blog post about what are the obstacles for companies to actually embrace curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the things was time. Do you allocate the time? But another one was having an openness to making mistakes and having weird ideas. And if you're too self-conscious,
Yeah.
if you have a fixed mindset, meaning you only can think this far, then you don't get to see the peripheral vision that is so important. This is particularly true as we get older. So Arthur Brooks, in his book From Strength to Strength, profiles MEA and talks about the fact that when we're young, we have fluid intelligence, which is fast and focused. But
Mm-hmm.
as we get older, we lose that a little bit. And instead of being fast and focused, we get crystallized intelligence, which is more systemic and holistic in its thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So you could make a strong argument that, as surprising as it would be, that the older you get, the more expansive and future oriented you might be in thinking. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, as a lot of the futurists in the world are 45 and older.
Right.
Um, they're not necessarily 25-year-olds who are going to live into the future longer than I will live, but they don't. It's partly because as we get older, we think more systemically, holistically, and connect the dots. And I think I used to know a long time ago, Faith Popcorn.
Yeah.
Who's it? I don't know if you've ever met her, but she's
I
also
have
in.
not, but I definitely know who she is. And in fact, I had all these people telling me I was a futurist a few years ago. And I'm like, oh, what the heck that is? And they were like, you are the next Faith Popcorn. And I was like, what? Who is that? So,
Yeah, she's weird, and I loved her for her weirdness and her name, which she adopted that name.
oh, that's
Um,
not her real name.
that's
Okay.
not her real name. No, I can't remember. She had a great Jewish name, and I like, but she just changed it to Faith Popcorn.
That's
Um,
brilliant.
and so, long story short, is I love that futurists are often they're synthesizing, they're tapping into pattern recognition.
Yep.
And pattern recognition is something you get better at with age because you have
Absolutely.
more patterns to look at. You have more raw material. And
100%.
so just know that you're going to get better and better at what you're doing.
I love that. I love that. Well, you also mentioned the idea of a growth mindset. So I'd love to talk about the theory of a growth mindset, which is Dr. Carol Dweck's theory, which for our audience is the belief that you can develop your abilities, intelligence, and talents through dedication, effort, and perseverance. So a growth mindset enhances future readiness by encouraging you to see challenges as growth opportunities and to persist through setbacks. And you've posted that many companies are afflicted by a fixed mindset, and that seeing yourself and your company as a work in progress that is open to taking calculated risks and learning from mistakes. It sounds obvious, but
Yeah.
is relatively unusual in the CYA, cover your bleep, corporate world.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, why do you sense fixed mindsets are so pervasive in the corporate world? And what wisdom would you offer for leaders who want to foster their team's growth mindset as a strategic competency to really enhance their future readiness?
Many companies, especially if they're a public company, are very focused on the short term. And the managers look to their leaders look to their managers and say, what have you done for me lately? Make the quarter look better. And that kind of thinking doesn't allow for experimentation or thinking long term. My shorthand of fixed versus growth mindset based upon Carol's work is, in a fixed mindset, you want to prove yourself and you define success as winning. In a growth mindset, you improve yourself and you define success as learning.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a fixed mindset, that means you're trying to constantly prove yourself and win. And often in the context of many businesses, especially if it's a public company with quarterly earnings, the way you win is based upon your performance in the last quarter.
Right.
And therefore, you don't want to go too far outside the box. That's going to actually give you some short-term results that aren't very good. And so a growth mindset has a long-term perspective on it. It says, I'm going to get better at this over time. I don't have to be good at it now. I have faith that I will improve over time and I'll learn. And my best description here is Satya, at the CEO of Microsoft. So Microsoft was a has-been at the end of the Steve Ballmer era. It was losing market share. Its stock price wasn't doing very well. And then Satya came in as the CEO, and the very first thing he did at a strategic level, I don't know the very first thing he did. He probably picked out the color of his carpet. But the very first thing I know that's been public about what he did is he said, we are going to create a growth mindset.
Yeah.
We're going to focus on learning, because there are too many people here in this building or in our offices or in our company that are trying to be the smartest person in the room.
Right.
And I want people who are the most curious people in the room, the people who are interested in improving, who become beginners over and over again. And lo and behold, taking a very growth mindset perspective and training his team on growth mindset. Microsoft is a radical turnaround in the last 10 years in terms of whether it's AI or a whole bunch of things that the company has done that show that, frankly, they're not a has-been. They are a will be.
Yeah, and to turn around a company that is a Titanic and do it in such a short amount of time, I think it's just proof positive that these strategic competencies that are maybe don't get as much attention in the news, or maybe there hasn't been as much research proving its value yet. It just really goes to show that things like curiosity, growth mindsets are actually what can make a huge difference. And I believe is say the skills of the future, but the future is actually here today.
Yeah. Actually, William Gibson, the science fiction writer, the future is here. It's just not easy. Yeah, it's not just evenly distributed yet.
Yes, one of my favorite quotes.
Yeah, it's a beautiful quote, and it's a perfect quote for a futurist.
Indeed, it is. Indeed, it is. So to dig a little deeper into sort of the culture building, what practices have you found effective in cultivating this type of culture, a learning culture at MEA? And what's been the hardest or even the most surprising about it?
Back in my Airbnb era, we would have a failure of the month club, and we did that.
Normalizing it.
Yeah. So how do you create some positives around a failure that is going to serve us in the future? Now, we didn't do it 5 years later because sometimes the failure of today isn't obvious as a success for something that happens 5 years from now. Right. So it was not always an easy one and sometimes there was a sting because, oh my God, we just lost a bunch of money on that idea. But what we really wanted to do was help people to see experimenting and thinking of a failure as a noble experiment. And that's really what we tried to do as much as possible, is to look as failure as just the path to success ultimately. So that's really important. So in terms of the socialization, I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area and based in San Francisco. And in that culture, the sociology of the region was like, oh, of course, Chip, this all makes sense. But it's not as obvious in a lot of other cultures, a lot of other regions. And so what I'm telling you here if in a tech company in the Bay Area, you might like, oh, that's obvious. But no, doing this in other companies makes sense. Procter and Gamble, I've spent some time in their headquarters in Cincinnati 2 different times. And I really love the fact that they actually have a history museum there. So in terms of imagining the future, you got to look at the past. And so
Right.
they look at failures or surprises. If you look at the variety of crazy ideas, whether it's Velcro or Viagra, both of those products, and that's a
Uh-huh.
weird to put those two V's together,
Yes.
Velcro and Viagra. Both of those started because of curiosity.
Right.
There was
Yeah.
not an intention to create Velcro. Viagra was a treatment for another
Heart.
illness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Heart disease.
Okay. So there's an element of becoming a first-class noticer. And
Yes.
again, taking the blinders off and saying, what are we supposed to learn from this? So I'll tell you something that I've been doing for a long time since I was age 28 is every weekend I sit down and I spend 20 to 30 minutes and I say, what were my biggest lessons of the past week?
Yeah.
And how will they serve me in the future? And the reason I do that is because actually trying to understand and making sense of and digesting and metabolizing my experiences allows me to learn from them. Because I think our painful life lessons are often the raw material for our future wisdom. And
Yeah.
so, long story short, is that's really what's led me to accelerate my wisdom over time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So much is coming up for me. Well, first of all, so Ohio is my home state. So shout out to Ohio.
Yes.
I love to joke that I'm probably one of the only futurists who's obsessed. Like I'm a big historical nonfiction nerd because I do look to history. I look to the past, the present, and the future in my work. And again, it's about connecting those dots. And there are many lessons that we can learn from history, whether it's in the context of your company or even larger historical lessons. So when Gutenberg and the printing press in the 15th century, that was a big change in how the information infrastructure and the impact that it had on society. A lot of what was happening at the time around trust and communication. And it's very germane to what's happening today around bots and like news. And so I always encourage leaders to look to history because it is a rich tapestry of wisdom and insights that you can harness as you're envisioning the future's possibilities. And the other thing that comes up for me when you're talking about surprises and really noticing them, I have a shorthand for this, which also is going to date me, but I don't know if you remember the 1990 CNC Music Factory song, The Things That Make You Go, and I will send it to you
Okay.
because it'll make you, or at least it makes me, I literally do this little dance. And in my head, I go, things that make you go, because I have a physical reaction to something that I have noticed that it is an anomaly, an outlier, or a surprise. And then I'm intentional about, well, how can I take this input, whatever it is and wherever it comes from, and catalog it, and I might be able to apply it elsewhere. And so
Yep.
that is how a lot of those innovations that you mentioned came to be, is you have to be hyper aware. You have to really, really notice what's going on around you, which I think that is a great segue into the next topic, which is around change. Now, you've written about navigating change as an essential skill in life and modern business. Now, I challenge the belief that change is hard. I have a bit of a bone to pick with that because I don't think it has to be, because I think it's about turning uncertainty into your strategic advantage. And it's really about being proactive in managing the uncertainty that comes with change. And one way I do that as a futurist and strategist is with the discipline of foresight. And research shows that companies that have a dedicated foresight methodology and resources are 33% more profitable and achieve a 200% higher growth rate than the average company that doesn't, which shows that there are real bottom line benefits to anticipating and embracing change. And so I'm curious, speaking of sense making, how are you detecting and making sense of changes on the horizon? And how are you using those insights to inform MEA's long-term strategies?
So let me say that I have a semantics thought I want to throw out first.
Sure.
While I will use the words change and transition interchangeably, I think change is often circumstantial and situational and it's outside of you.
Mm-hmm.
Transition is psychological, spiritual, and it's inside you. So if you're changing something, you might change your spouse or your job, but 2 years later, you're complaining about the new spouse or the new boss.
Right.
And when you're going through a transition, you're altering not just inside of you, but the landscape and more importantly, the pair of glasses you're
Paradigm.
looking, the paradigm, but also the pair of glasses you're using to look at the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I make that distinction because change for change's sake can take a lot of time. Change management, that's great. But if it's not created an internal, corporate, or personal change shift, then you're going to just have a new landscape, but I want to start with that. Secondly, yeah, of course, we live in an era where, my God, there's so much going on, change, transition, etc. And a lot of it's external. Bruce Feiler is one of our great author, one of our faculty members, and he's shown that half of the change out there, and he has 4 different quadrants.
Uh-huh.
There's change that is explicit. There's change that is by choice versus involuntary, voluntary versus involuntary,
Which are
and
very different.
very different. And positive or negative, I think, is the other one. And
Mm.
a lot of the change that we have thrust upon us these days is involuntary and negative, and
Yeah.
or perceived that way. And
Right.
I think that shift is that, okay, how do you make COVID, and which is involuntary and negative for sure, how do you turn that into a positive? How do you
Mm-hmm.
make it, how do you shift it? So there's a change on the landscape, you have to deal with it,
Right.
but we're going to make some transitions internally about how we operate and moving forward, and not just during COVID, but after COVID. Oh, yeah, remote work is a major change, but it's a change that was created by COVID or popularized by COVID.
Right.
And it's led to some transitional thinking in terms of how companies operate.
Yeah.
And
A
so
much needed transitional thinking too.
let's recognize then that, okay, sometimes a change that looks awful in the moment catalyzes a transition that
Right.
helps to shift the internal way the company is operating or seeing itself.
Yeah.
And so that's how I'd look at it.
Yeah, I love that because that's in the work that I do. I always start with the person or the people, the executives that are in the room, because you have to start with what's one of the first questions I ask, what's calling you now, right? To start to understand what the purpose is. And then you also have to start, well, what are the assumptions and unhelpful biases that I have? How am I stuck? So a lot of the work that I do is really starting to work on the minds of the people involved before we can even begin to start to address what's happening externally or what could be happening. So I think that's a helpful frame for people is start with the mind.
Yeah. Yep.
Start with the thinking. So now you are someone who is constantly pushing boundaries and redefining what's possible, whether that's disrupting the hospitality industry twice or what you're doing now to reframe the concept of aging. Now, for me, disruption is not about disruption for disruption's sake, but it's more about purposeful innovation that paves the way for a better future. And you said that the earliest kind of innovation is an experiment. We were talking about experiments earlier. And that where you do your best to limit your risks because you have no idea, but you still don't have any idea of whether it's going to work out, right? And so I'm curious, what do you think are some common misconceptions about disruption, and how are you approaching innovation and experimentation while keeping MEA's long-term vision and strategy and focus?
Well, I think, first of all, sometimes you stumble into a disruption. I don't know anybody who goes out and says, I want to be a disruptor. People may say it, but
Right. They don't know what it means, maybe.
it's often coming from the place of, I want to become a billionaire. The Airbnb founders didn't start by becoming a disruptor.
Right.
But what the disruption could come from the idea that something's just not working. Why
Right.
is it taxis are just so awful? And Travis at Uber had the idea of like, okay, well, let's create an alternative. I think that a lot of the disruptions that happen, and when it comes to MEA, we're doing 2 disruptions right now. One is for higher education. And I don't want to say we're trying to actually put universities out of business. We're actually collaborating with universities, but we're saying to them, you have spent way too many years exclusively focusing on 18 to 25-year-olds. And it's time for you to actually imagine what would be long life learning, not just lifelong learning, long life learning so that people can learn how to live a life that's as deep and meaningful as it is long. That's what MEA is in the business of. We're also trying to disrupt retirement communities because we have regenerative communities where we build homes around a regenerative farm and have regenerative living principles. So sometimes the idea, comes upon you. And in this case, it did come upon me. Like, okay, this is what we want to do. But then when I started to look at the two industries that we might disrupt, higher education and retirement communities, wow, they are both ready to be disrupted.
Yeah.
In the sense that they're pretty static in terms of how they operate. And so that's the opportunity. So that's when you can look at the landscape and say, I have a great idea. I think let's look at what's out there. And then you can say, does this idea, is it going into a place where there's room for disruption to happen?
Yeah.
And so I think you start with the idea, you start with the sense like I'm agitated because fill in the blank. But oh my gosh, the CEO of Netflix.
Oh,
Reed Hastings. Yeah, Reed Hastings. I was thinking Reed Hoffman, very similar name. But Reed Hastings was agitated about the fact that at the video store, he had this huge late fee. And then he was going on his way to the gym. And he all of a sudden thought, I'm going to the gym where I have a monthly membership and I can go show up as much as I want. What if I could have as many DVDs by mail as I want? And there's no price, there's no cost if I want to keep it for 3 weeks or a month.
right.
So he was curious about, but agitation as a customer was what it was at the heart of it. And so I think for me, the agitation at the heart of MEA is this combination of why don't we help people in midlife find the tools and the rituals even to help them understand how to curate a beautiful second half of their adult life. And why couldn't we create communities, residential communities that are not about gated communities and there's no young people there and it's all about bingo and golf, but how do we help people to actually feel regenerated by the experience of getting older in a community that has intergenerational people and has a farm so you can actually go out and harvest out there and it's connected with the local community so that it's not just some isolated age apartheid residential community.
Right. Yeah. What's coming up for me is, I think first of all, starting with what agitation is a great sparker of imagination. And imagination is the ability to create what does not exist today. And also innovation can be applying things in a new context. And so in the Netflix example, that would be where he was like, oh, okay, well, why can't I just reapply this type of model to an industry where this hasn't been applied yet? And I think the last thing that kind of comes up for me is there's a belief that disruption completely ignores the past, and it doesn't have to be, right? Like legacy systems, yes, they a lot often need to be reimagined, but that historical context is important, and you can build disruptive strategies off the past by leveraging existing strengths and integrating new innovations with old wisdom, which sounds like in terms of your collaboration with the university, you're not trying to say, hey, you guys are done, you guys are toast. It's more about, no, how can we take what you do really well and maybe reimagine or do things differently in other areas and actually expand your customer base?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So you're on a mission to reframe the concept of aging, and being a company that's reimagining how we view and experience later life isn't easy, right? Because it's something that is so deeply ingrained in our culture and societal norms. It requires both personal and systemic change. And the guiding principle of my work is prevention is better than cure. And while it is true for your health, it's also true for your company's health. And the biggest mistake I see is companies waiting till it's too late to think about the long term. And so I'm curious, what gaps or maybe difficulties are you facing when anticipating and strategizing for MEA's future, where you have this really meaningful and robust vision? And what wisdom would you offer for leaders who are struggling with similar challenges?
I think the biggest challenge when you're ahead of the game, you're a pioneer,
Yeah.
is there's a lot of people out there who are going to tell you why you're wrong. and why it's
Mm.
not going to work. And that was my experience as a boutique hotelier, where people said people want predictability when they're traveling. They don't want to have a hot restaurant in the hotel. They don't want like a design flavor. That's very niche, Chip. Well, I was like, okay, I'll create a series of niche hotels, and I think the overall niche of boutique hotels will be big. And I was right.
Yeah.
Airbnb. Oh my God, people will never want to stay in each other's homes. What all the safety concerns, all the risks, etc. There were that business. I have to even admit on my own side was like, I don't know about this idea when the founders 12 years ago first approached me. But guess what? We had to have enough confidence, and then we had to figure out how to mitigate those risks.
Right.
Similarly, the language around aging, elder is not a well-loved word. Um, Midlife is not a well-loved word.
Yeah.
Aging, senior, we have a really ageist perspective on this. And to be quite frank, there is no great language. No one has yet come up with it to say, oh, this is the aspirational language for aging. And therefore, in some ways, we are selling a product to a customer who doesn't want to think about it. They may think about anti-aging products to change the color of their hair or make their skin look more flourishing. But the idea of pro-aging products, which is what we are, to help people feel like life gets better with age, is a really new idea. So there's occasional people saying to me, "You're nuts, Chip." And I have to come from a place of saying, thank God, actually, that both other businesses did well and I did financially well. So this one, I don't pay myself. I think it's going to be successful. It is successful so far, and it's growing very quickly. And I don't have to use the traditional metrics of ROI, return on investment, that I've had to use in the past. My new
Yeah.
ROI is ripples of impact.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at what kind of impact are we having?
Yeah. Well, I think redefining success metrics when you are doing something that hasn't been done before or that people aren't really comfortable with is really important. Not being afraid to defy industry norms or any norms, I think is something that is really powerful. And it's funny. So Pfizer was a client of mine, oh gosh, 12, 15 years ago. And I actually led a campaign called Get Old. And we can talk about that later on. But as I said in our warm-up chat, like I've been obsessed with the topic of aging starting in my 30s because I saw, even though the campaign was incredibly successful, but yet just the response to the language, it was a communications campaign for Pfizer corporate, right? And I just before I started realizing my own age related problems that I wanted to solve early on, I thought it was just so fascinating around the cultural resistance. Where there is resistance and where there are tension, there are great opportunities.
Agreed.
Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we bring our conversation to a close?
My new book's called Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age. So I think people can look at that if that is interesting. And if you don't want to buy anything, just go to the MEA website and check out Wisdom Well, the blog. And that's my daily blog. And that's a way to tap into some of the thoughts we've talked about today.
Amazing. Now, a final question before you share where listeners can find out more about you. So, in your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Oh, of course, it's the latter. Duh. I mean, come on.
You'd
Yeah.
be surprised at what people say, Chip.
Oh my God. No, well, for this podcast, it's hard to believe that you'd say the opposite. You have to have the vision, and then you have to have the roadmap. The roadmap is the vision is what you start with.
Yeah.
And then the roadmap is where you do the risk mitigation. But you got to start with the vision. And the vision is about the opportunity.
Yeah. And with that, where can people go to find out more about you and your work? I know you mentioned your blog, but is it LinkedIn?
Yeah. LinkedIn, I post most of my blog posts on my LinkedIn profile. And the MEA website is meawisdom.com. And my personal website is chipconley.com, Conley.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and brilliant insights, Chip. It has been enlightening. I have learned so much from you, and I've had so much fun exploring with you today.
Thank you. Listen, I love talking about this stuff.
Likewise. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.